So in this video, I'm going to review the difference between a hypothesis and a theory, right? So oftentimes we'll use that term incorrectly in everyday language. That includes me, that includes other professors, this includes people in the media, but in everyday conversation, you'll find that people are using it incorrectly, at least from a research perspective, right? So as a researcher, we have a very, very specific and technical definition for what these two things mean. And let me give you this example to see if I could illustrate it. So let's say somebody tells you, I have a theory. I believe that when people go outside with wet hair, they're more likely to get sick. I don't have that issue, so I'm in the clear apparently. But if you go outside with wet hair, you get sick, right? That's what they would say, and they say theory. It's not a theory, it's a hypothesis. So let's break this down and explain why. So your observation might be, right, so we start off with an observation. The observation might be somebody got sick. My family member got sick, I got sick. Now, whether that person got sick, that's not the question. That's not debated, right? That person has a fever that's above 101. They have joint pains, they're coughing, right? They're in bed, they're tired, right? So that's clear, they're sick. Why are they sick, right? That's what we're trying to figure out. That's where we make hypotheses. Well, I think they got sick because they were hanging out with their partner who was already sick a week ago. I think they got sick because they went out with wet hair. I think they got sick because I saw them go out without a sweater. I think they got sick because they weren't washing their hands, right? These are all hypotheses, not theories, right? So keep that in mind. That's a hypothesis, right? First the observation, then when you start trying to figure out the why, why did they get sick? Now you're making hypotheses, right? That's a plural of hypothesis. So keep that in mind. Most of the time, when we're trying to figure out something, why did this happen? We're thinking of a hypothesis. Now, then what is a theory? Okay, so sometimes we might start off with a theory. Sometimes we develop a theory, right? So let's say over time you kept observing individuals getting sick, and you gained more and more evidence, and you eliminated the bad hypotheses, right? That hair doesn't seem to have to do with getting sick or not, because Dr. R also gets sick, so it can't be that. So what is it that leads people to getting sick? Maybe you find that when there's a sudden change in body temperature, people get sick. Maybe exposure to germs, people get sick. So you get more and more evidence, and eventually you might develop a theory that explains how sickness works, right? How people get sick, or how people get a cold. To give you a psychology example, let's think back to, so some of you, I say think back because some of you have been exposed to the example. Some of you might not have been, but there's a theory in developmental psychology that attachment formed between an infant and a parent. Back then they were thinking only mother, but between a parent, because the parent provided what that infant needed to survive, right? Food, shelter, protection, and that's where attachment formed, right? Because this adult was providing that kind of support to this infant, that led to an attachment forming, right? So there's that theory that exists, right? And that theory was supported by testing of hypotheses, right? Well, okay, let's see what happens when they're with a grandmother, and the grandmother's providing these. Do we see attachment forming? Let's see what happens when the parent can't provide for that child, or is neglectful due to various situations. Does attachment still form between the parents? And over time they gained evidence supporting this idea that no, there's something about this providing this kind of support that leads to forming attachment. In a future video, I'm going to go over a theory that actually challenged this theory, but this is how a theory forms, right? You keep getting evidence that supports this point of view that attachment forms because the adult is providing some type of protection, allowing this infant to survive, and that's where attachment comes from. And over experiments, after testing all these hypotheses, I found that, what I found so far has supported this theory. It doesn't mean that theories can't change, right? Because you might later on get evidence suggesting, well, that's part of it, but really there's more to that story, more going on. And future studies will come out challenging that theory and showing that there's actually some other explanation that better explains how attachment forms. Okay, so just to review and to link the idea of hypothesis and theory to this class, right? Let's kind of go through the steps. So first, an observation. Well, infants form attachments to adults. That's not debated. We know that happens. Why does that happen? Why do infants get attached, form this attachment, this bond with adults? Well, I think it's because they're providing protection and sustenance and helping their survival. That's a hypothesis. Test it, test it, test it, test it. Multiply hypotheses. Let's see how this works out. Let's see if this kind of general idea of providing support and survival for this infant is linked to attachment. Yes, I'm getting support for that idea. Then you have theory. Now you might start off with a theory too. Based on that theory, right? So we have this theory that attachment forms based on an adult being able to help the survival of an infant. Well, okay, let me come up with a new research question based on that. If that's the case, does that apply to, then that should apply to any adult, right? Let me take infants and look at how attachments form in situations where it's not their biological parents, right? Or where the parents aren't providing that kind of protection and support. Do we still see attachment form, right? So sometimes you might, oftentimes, not just sometimes you might start off with a theory. Sometimes you start off with an observation and there's no existing theory yet, right? So keep that in mind. You have to have these steps. So keep that in mind, right? That research includes all these steps. Observation, research question, hypothesis, eventually theory, and we go back again. And sometimes when we get evidence that challenges a theory, we would modify the theory and decide, well, do we have to scrap the theory completely because that theory doesn't really help us understand what's going on here anymore.